It has been said that the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. Censorship doesn't protect the vulnerable. It rewrites history to the benefit of the powerful and to the detriment of the people. As a prolific journalist and author, Michael Shellenberger understands this keenly. Michael's work is difficult to describe simply because it's so wide-ranging. Yet one theme emerges. From the death of environmentalism to progressive's destruction of cities, Michael has uncovered it all, and he's done so with courage. Recently, Michael released part of the Twitter files, showing how the FBI and intelligence community discredited factual information about Hunter Biden's foreign business dealings. He also testified before the House Select Committee on the weaponization of the federal government, where he challenged the censorship industrial complex, detailing the U.S. government's support for domestic censorship and disinformation campaigns from 2016 to 2022. Insofar as we can evaluate the past few years of American history with integrity, we have Michael to thank for his dogged reporting. This evening, Michael's lecture is titled, "Escape the Woke Matrix," and there will be time for questions afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Michael Shellenberger to the stage.
Thank you very much. What a great pleasure to be here. You've all heard the news. Climate change is destroying your future. Carbon dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere. The planet has warmed 1.1 degrees centigrade since the pre-industrial period. Global warming is killing the Great Barrier Reef. We also know that police killing black people is a pandemic. Murders of trans people nearly doubled over the past 4 years. But there's more to this story. Carbon emissions peaked in Great Britain over 50 years ago. Same thing in France, the United States, and indeed, over the last decade, total global emissions declined. Why haven't you read that in the New York Times or the Washington Post? Deaths from natural disasters have diminished to a few hundred a year in the United States, even as the global population quadrupled over the last century. They've declined internationally by over 90%. The cost of disasters everywhere is on decline. Why is nobody telling you that? As a result of declining deaths from extreme weather events and declining costs, what gets counted as a natural disaster has also declined. There's only one database that tracks natural disasters. It's the MDAT data center in Belgium, and total global weather and climate disasters have declined. How come nobody is saying that? The Great Barrier Reef recorded the highest amount of coral in 36 years, and maybe longer, because that's the amount of time that we've been studying and measuring the great coral, the reef on the great coral, on the Great Barrier Reef. Why is nobody telling you that? These are my books. After I lost all of my friends and all of my financial support, not an intuitive move in your late 40s, I decided to put all my heartbreak into a single book, Apocalypse Never, which came out in 2020. I had the good fortune of it selling, and so I got to write a follow-up book, which was to understand, why do people who say they care more than anybody else let people suffering from schizophrenia smoke fentanyl and have the bottom parts of their legs rot on the street, where they are then taken into the hospital and have the bottom parts of their legs amputated? Why do they then put them back on the street? Why do we spend 10 times more than other cities on homelessness and have those outcomes? How is that compassionate, and why is it done in the name of care? There are no racial differences in police killings when accounting for whether or not the suspect was armed or a threat, justified or unjustified. Everybody knows this. There's no real debate about the data. The person who's done the most to discover this is Roland Fryer at Harvard University. You might have heard of Harvard University, and yet nobody talks about this. Police killings of African Americans declined from 217 per year in the 1970s to 157 per year in the 2010s in 58 of the largest US cities. That's based on FBI data that my colleagues and I personally crunched. This is wonderful news. Police killings of all races declined dramatically from 59 per year between 1970 and 1975 to 12 per year. Now, the rate of police killings in San Francisco and Oakland did increase slightly from 2.7 to 2.8 per year respectively in the 70s, 2.4 and 3.9, but police killings per capita in those two cities declined by 8.3%. So when you account for the increase in population, it also declined. Researchers do not know if trans people are being killed disproportionately in comparison to cisgender people, nor do they know if trans homicides are rising, nor if trans people are being killed for being trans or for some other reason. There is no debate over this data. And yet CBS News irresponsibly and other news outlets suggest that they are. And that should upset you, especially if you care very much about trans people, because what you would not want to do is have a bad baseline for monitoring such terrible forms of violence. Why in the world does everybody get it so horribly wrong, unethically wrong, not just analytically wrong? Some of these things are easier to explain than others. There have been major disinformation campaigns waged by senior leaders in our government. They got an entire FBI investigation based on a made-up memo that suggested that Putin controlled Trump because prostitutes urinated on him in a bed. That is what happened. My mother still believes that Trump is a Russian asset because of that disinformation campaign. The labs leak all the time and have leaked for 50 years all around the world. The idea that COVID might have leaked from a lab was obvious to everybody, including the scientists who emailed Anthony Fauci on January 30th, 2020. In their email to him, they said, "We think it's more likely to be a lab leak." Several days later, Fauci perpetuated a disinformation campaign that suggested that you were a racist for suggesting that the COVID-19 virus came from a lab, but not a racist if you thought it came from Chinese people eating bats. That happened. People said it was misinformation to suggest that vaccines had side effects. People said that the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation, not that it fell into a bathtub because Hunter Biden was hammered and smoking crack. Instead, somehow the Russians had gotten Hunter Biden's laptop data and then got it onto a laptop and then dropped it off at a computer repair store. It was the most cockamamie story, a conspiracy theory, and it was perpetuated by senior members of the US government, retired and employed. And people say that the Twitter files just showed people doing content moderation, not censorship. These are senior elected officials who carried out this disinformation campaign. We now know absolute certainty that the FBI should never have launched that probe. Here's the email from the senior scientist to Fauci. Some of the features potentially look engineered. The furin cleavage site that does not belong on the spike protein was obviously engineered, and people knew that right away. And yet the Washington Post suggested that Tom Cotton keeps repeating a coronavirus fringe theory that scientists have disputed. The original headline, which Washington Post changed without acknowledging it on their article, said that he was spreading a debunked conspiracy theory. The Washington Post, which broke the famous Watergate scandal, spreads disinformation. Fauci and his colleagues constructed a fake science article in one of the formerly greatest medical journals in the world, suggesting conspiracy theories were what those lab leak hypotheses were. The Great Barrington Declaration, co-authored by a new friend, Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford University, that Jay Bhattacharya is a fringe epidemiologist, a full professor at Stanford University, and one of the most beautiful individual people you'll ever meet. And Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, the greatest medical organization and organizations in the world, formerly greatest, said that there needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of his premises. The Great Barrington Declaration argued that the approach to the pandemic should be the approach to the pandemic that everybody agreed the approach to a pandemic should be before there was a pandemic, which is known as focused protection of the most vulnerable, but allowing children to go to school so they could actually learn something. I don't want to make it personal, but you do need to name names when you are uncovering bad behavior. And this person, Renee DiResta, is the smartest of the people in every room she's in, and she's a former CIA fellow, ostensibly former. One of the things that you learn when you interview people in the intelligence community is they say, nobody retires from the intelligence community. Nobody retires from it. This is a person who ran a censorship operation with US taxpayer dollars that involved the Department of Defense, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Homeland Security. It subcontracted out the censorship work to 4 organizations that constituted the creme de la creme, people that went to places like Harvard and Stanford and apparently had their consciences ripped out from their hearts and their brains and got themselves in a situation of censoring the rabble, or what Hillary Clinton calls the deplorables, for doing things like questioning the elections or sharing stories of vaccine side effects on Twitter and Facebook. This was such a smashing success that they're now exporting to other countries, and there's nothing that's been done to stop this. Our work has not stopped this. This is continuing. Here's what Twitter did to Jay Bhattacharya. They put him on a blacklist. The word blacklist is not my word. That's the Twitter internal word. You can see it right there in yellow on his profile, Trends Blacklist. You can imagine the shock that overcame Barry Weiss and Matt Taibbi and I when we saw this. He's one of the most important epidemiologists in the world, and he was on a blacklist because he suggested doing with the pandemic what everybody agreed we should do during a pandemic before there was a pandemic. The behavior from the White House is remarkable. Thuggish would describe it, bullying. Rob Flaherty in particular, who sent this email to Facebook and got this response back from Facebook, whose names we shielded, not the public officials, their names should be known. And the Facebook executive said, yes, sir, please know that we are censoring even true stories of vaccine side effects. So mothers sharing stories of their children getting sick from the vaccine had their posts censored without their knowledge so that other mothers would not see them. This happened, and there's no debate about that this happened. There's a lawsuit about this, and a question is only whether it violated the First Amendment. It's still, in my humble view, as a non-First Amendment scholar, a violation of the First Amendment to have the government have other people demand the censorship or to demand that Facebook engage in the censorship. Matt Taibbi discovered that in this email from the Virality Project, which was a project funded by US government contractors, that they demanded that Twitter censor, and you can see it in the yellow highlight in the middle, true content which might promote vaccine hesitancy. It's not that the information was wrong, because of course the First Amendment also protects wrong information, but they wanted to censor accurate information because they were worried that people might get the wrong idea and choose not to get the vaccine. I got the vaccine, I got boosted, vaccines are a miracle, but this is totalitarian tactics to censor this kinds of information. FBI came to us, said Mark Zuckerberg, as he has rapidly sought to shift the blame away from taking responsibility. The FBI came to us and were like, hey, you should be on the high alert. We thought there was a lot of Russian propaganda in the 2016 election. There's about to be some kind of dump similar to that. He's referring to the FBI coming to them to say that they should be ready to censor the Hunter Biden laptop. That's weird, because there had been no publicity of the Hunter Biden laptop yet. Perhaps it's just a coincidence that the FBI had been sitting on the Hunter Biden laptop for almost a year. And this wasn't the beginning. Twitter was under intense pressure. We have seen a sustained effort by the intelligence community to push us to share more info and change our API policies. They're probing and pushing everywhere they can, including by whispering to congressional staff, complained the Twitter director of policy on January 2020. The story exploded on October 14th. Twitter's internal trust and safety department, which is the censorship department at Twitter, evaluated the New York Post article, and they concluded that it did not violate Twitter's terms of service, that the article was there was no evidence that it was inaccurate or that it was a result of hacking. They censored it anyway. Here's the subpoena from the FBI confiscating the laptop in December 2019, of almost a year before the New York Post story. Here's the signature by Hunter Biden on the receipt dropping the laptop off at the computer repair store after he had dropped it in the bathtub or the pool. Weirdly enough, in the Twitter files, we discovered that there had been preparation for how to not cover the Hunter Biden laptop months before the New York Post published an article about the Hunter Biden laptop. What's the Aspen Institute doing, gathering journalists to talk about how not to cover a story that hadn't even broke yet? What is going on here? Why is it that they were programming journalists to disregard one of the most important journalistic principles that's been in place for over 50 years? It's known as the Pentagon Papers principle, and it's if it's a whistleblower comes to you and they have documents showing that the Pentagon knows that they're losing the war in Vietnam, that the New York Times and the Washington Post shall publish those documents because that's important to the public interest, and God damn it, it's protected by the First Amendment of the US Constitution. That is what journalists do, and the New York Times and the Washington Post published that article, the Pentagon Papers. They won their Pulitzers for it. They defended it in court, and they won it at the Supreme Court. Steven Spielberg thought it was such an amazing story, he made a movie about it. The Aspen Institute with Stanford, with US federal government money, has been attacking this, saying, don't cover the material, cover the person who leaked it. You might remember that they disparaged Daniel Ellsberg, the Nixon folks, because he'd been going to a psychotherapist, so they tried to suggest he was a crazy person. That tactic is now being used by Democrats to disparage anybody who leaks information central to the public interest, like how's the war in Ukraine going? Interests that we share, that are public interests, that are protected by the First Amendment, that are precisely why the people that created our country demanded that there be the First Amendment to the Constitution. They didn't want the Constitution to even be in place. They didn't want a United States of America unless there was a First Amendment. That's how important it was. That's why they made it first. It's now being attacked by the people who claim to be the defenders of liberalism and democracy. It's being attacked right now. Here's the little memo they created. You can see at the top, September 2020, Aspen Digital Hack and Dump Working Group, how to brainwash journalists so they don't cover the obvious thing that's sitting in front of their face. It's all done in the name of protecting people, fragile people, and need to be protected from information, which is so dangerous. Here's Twitter's top censor, Yoel Roth. He said, you know, we got to get to Jack Dorsey, the CEO. We got to convince him. We got to start by censoring, without anybody knowing it, information that directly causes harm. Now they're trying to read your text messages. Pierre Omidyar, who made his money on eBay, spinning off Defense Department technology, they're now trying to read your encrypted text messages. And they're trying to create something called tip lines to turn everybody into little narcs. Why? You don't need the Stasi, you just have each other to go and report on your wrong think to the FBI or the CIA or whatever have it. Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who was so unpopular because her COVID policies were so wrong, hurt so many people, she's been picked up by Harvard to head up their censorship initiative. She's working with Facebook and Google to do it globally. It's much easier now to censor because there's only two important platforms, maybe just one, Facebook and Twitter. I mean, imagine having to censor hundreds of newspapers. You don't have to do that anymore. You can just censor Twitter and Facebook. It's much worse than you think, a whistleblower told me, who works for all the social media companies. There's a complex where cancellations and pressure campaigns are well organized by outside groups. It's a total conflict waged in every school, business, and platform. Is it a conspiracy? Is it a culture? Yes. Conspiracy means to breathe together. It's cancel culture with an inorganic overlay that we call the censorship industrial complex. This is here. It has arrived. It's in place. Our job now is simply to dismantle and defund it. So how did this happen? What was going on here? Propaganda, according to Jacques Ellul in his great book, draws on existing values. We want to move beyond racial discrimination. We want to move beyond discrimination against sexual minorities. And so they tap into that. So propaganda is about controlling the information environment. The concern of the advocates of disinformation isn't to wipe out every instance of a piece of information. Hunter Biden laptop story got out there, but people like myself and my mother and everybody in my liberal family all thought it was Russian disinformation. So the censorship was in service of the disinformation. It's not that the censorship, they know they can't be total. They don't need to be total. They just need to brainwash you into thinking that something is wrong when it's right. What is going on in 2010? Something happened. Zach Goldberg, Manhattan Institute, finds that the terms racist and racism just exploded into the news media in this period. And little surprise then that the ideology follows. How big of a problem is racism? It's a much bigger problem than people had thought. People thought it was a declining problem for years. We thought that relationships between white and black Americans had been pretty good, 70% in the last 20 years, and they just plummet after you're told repeatedly through propaganda that things had gotten worse somehow. Some of this is just the elites in an absolute panic after the revolutions of 2016, Brexit and Trump. They had to get control of the information environment. They had to be able to wage war when they wanted to wage war. They had all these overproduction of elites sitting around after they had successfully prosecuted the war on terror. They needed something to do. They turned inward. And they tapped into cancel culture, what we call wokeism, as predicates for censorship. Why, though? Why? Why can't we just live in peace and have debates and free speech? Why? Part of it, I think, has to do with the fact that nobody believes we don't have the traditional value systems that we used to have. This is a very old trend. This is what Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about in the mid-19th century, the death of God. We don't have traditional moral structures. The percentage of Americans with no religious identity has risen dramatically. Ernest Becker, in his brilliant Pulitzer Prize-winning 1975 book, said, "Man cannot endure his smallness unless he can translate it into meaningfulness at the largest possible level." The idea that we just die and turn into worm food is pretty depressing, particularly if you think that your life isn't very exciting or interesting. So we overcompensate by constructing monuments. to our lives. We can rest assured knowing that our names will live on. These are called immortality projects, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them, particularly if you sublimate and create beautiful immortality projects. The idea of death, the fear of it, haunts the human animal like nothing else. It's like a mainspring of human activity, designed largely to avoid the fatality of death, to overcome it by denying in some way that it is the final destiny of man. We deny it, we sublimate it, we create monuments, we write books, we lead political campaigns, but things can go terribly awry when we're outside of a positive moral framework. The problem of disbelieving in God is not that man ends up believing in nothing. It's much worse. He ends up believing anything. Climate change, a new external authority. You used to get right by God, now you get right by nature. You used to feel guilty for Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge. Now you feel guilty that we started using fossil fuels and technology and nuclear power and modern agriculture. We're guilty, 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 guilty. Nature's angry at you. It wants to punish you. There's no redemption, but you might avert narrowly apocalypse by harmonizing with nature through renewables and organics. Power has got to move from your local authorities, got to move from the people you vote for to the people that you don't vote for, to the experts in places like Brussels and the United Nations and International Energy, to people who know how to get you right by nature. We have a new priest class, and we have a new set of witches. Race is the new moral order. We know it used to be people of color, but that wasn't precise enough. Now we know it's BIPOC, so it's black, indigenous people to rule over Latinos and Asians on the moral hierarchy. It's got to be clear. You've got to feel guilty. There's no redemption, really, but you can get right by the new moral order by knowing your place. Get in your place. Know your race, get in your place. It's not about equal justice under the law anymore. That's an old idea. Now we're gonna have the laws enforced differently. Canada's pioneering this. California is pioneering this. We should be ruled by the victims. We can figure out who was victimized the most. They should have the most power. There's a new set of witches. A new view of human nature. You do have a soul. It's called your gender. You're the God. You can change your body however you like. Forget what they say about chromosomes and whatnot. You can reshape your body. You are who you say you are. Drugs and surgery are gender affirming. Preventing drugs and surgery is conversion therapy, and we have a new set of witches. Social media plays a role. Look at that. Jonathan Haidt is absolutely right. Anybody that's been reading Jonathan Haidt knows that he's won this argument. You got it, John. Stop. You've convinced everybody. You've made us all anxious. We feel like, oh my God, everybody's watching me. Everyone can see me. It's Foucault's panopticon. It's on your phone. Everybody can see. They can see I might be a bad person. I better get on the side of the bullies to protect myself. I better participate in the attacks on the witches, or I might be victimized. Anxiety, anxiety. We see the rise of cluster B personality disorders, which are described as 4 different manifestations. Some people think there's just a single, doesn't matter. DSM, antisocial, borderline, histrionic, narcissistic. I'm not diagnosing anybody. That's not what I'm about to do. But you see the behaviors and they're recognizable to you. The greatest scholar of narcissism, Sam Vaknin, says, I'm a narcissist, so take my word for it. Listen to me. And Sam is brilliant. Certain people are prone to adopt victimhood as an identity. Victimhood endows their life with meaning. You know this type of person. They would be victims even in situations where they've not been victimized. They want to be victimized. Look at me, I'm a victim. I have higher moral status than you because of it. So entitlement, grandiosity, I'm entitled to tell you what to do because I'm more of a victim than you. Splitting, you're either with me or you're against me. I need the attention, give it to me. Impaired reality, lack of empathy for oppressors, excessive empathy for victims. It's very dangerous if you're a perennial victim. This is your identity. You would tend to develop attendant behaviors. If you don't get special treatment, you'll become aggressive. You know what these folks are like. You feel like you're walking on eggshells around them. You're anxious around them. Splitting. Everyone says there is no black and white issue, said Greta Thunberg, but I think this is. Either we go on in civilization or we don't. We must stop using fossil fuels right now, or you're a bad person. The infiltration of narcissists and psychopaths is universal in all these victimhood movements. They become the public face of the movement. If you're going to go and celebrate your status by not wearing a mask and wearing a beautiful ball gown, and everyone else is wearing masks, then you better explain that, and you better explain why you're demanding that children wear masks in schools. What would lead otherwise decent people? I have no doubt that the people with their fists upheld no doubt that they are empathic people, caring people. They care more. What would lead them to do this? To raise their fists above this young woman who later said in a Washington Post op-ed that she attended Black Lives Matter protests. She supports police reform. She just didn't think that she should have to raise her fists against a mob, that's not what she understood the First Amendment in America to be about. If an individual in a position of political power is a psychopath, he or she can create an epidemic of psychopathology, and people who are not essentially psychopathic, they're not psychopaths. They're behaving like psychopaths. Create a culture of cluster B personality disorders. These are not the signs that people want to censor. They want to censor other people's signs, the signs that say respect trans people or your pronouns will be was, were. That's a death threat. That poster just went up in Britain today. The potential for aggression in victimhood movements is much larger than in the general population. Anything that is grievance-based leads to violence and death. These boots stomp turfs. If you start talking about a genocide against you and your folks, and there's no genocide, be very careful around these folks. That's dangerous, because if you think a genocide is being perpetuated against your people, then almost anything is justified. This is antisocial personality behaviors. These kinds of things. Assaulting somebody for what they said. It's narcissism. Pay attention to me. I threw soup on a Van Gogh painting. In the 1950s, these courageous students had milkshakes poured on their heads in order to be able to sit peacefully at a lunch counter in the South. Now they throw soup on the painting and they want to be famous. That's different motivations. That's not the same thing. Histrionic. My future's coming to an end. It's desperate. It must happen now. It's tempting to wonder, is it all coming to an end? Is this it? It's pretty dark. I never said it was going to be an uplifting speech. Civilizations, on average, 336 years. That's the most comprehensive study. We're at 250. It's been a good run. Not so fast, right? Come on. It's the United States of America. This place is amazing. Amazing. We have the First Amendment. We have the First Amendment. And we're going to fight for it, right? We're a country of renewal. We're a country we want change. You can remake yourself. Somehow I became a free speech advocate. I was like a nuclear power advocate like 5 minutes ago. The Netherlands was one of the first modern civilizations, rich. It's still great. God, have you been to Amsterdam? Incredible. They had an open drug scene, homeless crisis like we have, and they got people the care they needed. They got them into treatment. They intervened, got them on methadone, got them into recovery. Amsterdam is amazing. It's an old civilization, and they're doing great. You need at least these 4 things: equal justice under the law, meritocracy, cheap energy, freedom of speech. If you don't have them, you might be able to get away with the first 3, but then it's not a liberal democracy if it's just the first 3. So what do we do about it? You can't just condemn. My friends on the right, they love to condemn. Condemn, condemn, condemn. This is bad, bad, bad. It's not good enough. You have to explain it. That's what I've been trying to do. This is the most important book I read on this issue in the last couple of years. Politics is Andrew, I'm going to butcher it, Lobachewski, lived under the Nazis, lived under communism in Poland, a psychologist, and he said, it's not just it's not just that totalitarianism, it's not that the institutions are immoral and wrong. It's all, yes, that's true, but the people in them, they're psychopaths and narcissists. There's something wrong with the people that got in charge. It's a pathocracy, he said. It's a sick bureaucracy. You got to get those people out. You can't have psychopaths and narcissists running your government. Naturally, we should take care when confronting monsters, lest we not become them ourselves. For me, having come back to my faith, this is the most important challenge. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I can't do this, but it makes me better to try. And I came back to it when trying to figure out how do you deal with personalities like the cluster B personalities. It's not going to work if we hate them. It's going to take some courage. Some people are starting to show it. So thrilled Glenn Lowry's here. Glenn, such a fan. Peter Boghossian, my new friend, doesn't believe in God, but strong moral character, a man of courage. Horrible things were done to Peter, and he is a better person for it and overcame it. That's how you deal with victimization. You're not trying to avoid being a victim, you're seeking to overcome your victimization. That's the heroic journey. We're mortal. This is it, guys. Even if you think you're going to go on afterwards, as I do, it's not going to be this life again. You might be 19, you have a lot of years ahead of you, but you're not going to be 19 again. What are you going to do when you're 19? What are you going to do now? Are you going to be brave or not? It's usually pretty clear, actually. You just got to do the work, too. You got to just debunk the bad stuff. You just got to say it. It's wrong. You got to debunk it. You got to do it on Twitter. You got to do it in your books. It works. They start saying, hatred is increasing everywhere. It's increasing in California. Really? Compared to when? The 50s? 500 years ago? There's more hate. There's less hatred among common people of racial, religious, and sexual minorities at any time in recorded history. I mean, seriously. So let's go look at the data. I'm not very good at math or statistics at all, but I'm familiar with what's known as recording bias. You start recording a phenomenon, you get better at recording the phenomenon, you have to get better at accounting for you're getting better at recording it. So we're better at recording it. That's all this is. And they keep doing it. Look at these numbers, guys. Have you ever met anybody that doesn't think black and white people should be allowed to get married? But yet in 1961, 4% thought that should be legal. Americans are fundamentally optimistic people, so despite the propaganda, despite the misinformation, we think it's actually going to get better. So go read the footnotes and debunk that stuff. There could be an increase in reporting. That might have been the reason, said the researcher who put out the bullshit study at UC Berkeley, where the first thing you learn in your stats class is that there's a reporting bias. Come on, just debunk that stuff. And then go, why are you doing that? Why are you trying to make it seem like there's more hatred? What are you doing? Who gives you the right? How dare you? If there's more anti-Semitism in the society, I want to know. But if you start telling me that there's more anti-Semitism in society and there's not more anti-Semitism in society, shame on you. Oh, shame. That's terrible. You need to explain why you did that. Oh, such important newspapers, the New York Times and Financial Times. God, I used to want to be in those papers. I want to, write op-eds for the New York Times and Financial Times. So much status and prestige. Look at the garbage they do. On the left, look, hurricanes are going up because of climate change. Look, we just put the data in. There it is. You should be able to debunk this bullshit in minutes. Train yourself to do it and do it quickly. Make it a competition. First one to debunk it wins. You get to go viral on Twitter. That's your reward. Status, there's nothing wrong with status, okay? Go get your status for the right things. Go get your status for your courage and your acuity and your speed and your care and your compassion. It's total, utter bullshit. They cherry-picked post-1980 period to mislead the readers, the New York Times on the left, and then they did the exact same thing that they did with the hate data, misrepresenting better hurricane detection. What do you think happened over the last 100 years? Have you heard of satellites? You know how good satellites are at detecting hurricanes? Really freaking good. They don't miss a hurricane. Imagine 1900, you're on shore. Is there a hurricane out there? I don't know. Maybe. The New York Times published that. They did not correct it. And I made sure that the authors saw it, and they saw it. Landfalling U.S. hurricanes are flat. This is the data. There's no other data source. It actually slightly declines, but it's probably not accurate because the data is the data. It's a little bit messy, but it's flat. There's no increase of hurricanes. There's still 2.5 billion people in the world that have to use wood and dung to get their primary energy. That is fucking bullshit. There is no reason for that. These people, they can get LPG and gas. You interview women in the third world and you're like, what do you like about getting LPG? Being able to cook up a little pot of beans or rice as opposed to having to go get the wood and blow on the fire and breathe the smoke. What they say is they go, you know, when you get a little LPG and get the beans and the rice going, you can do something else. You can save labor. You can save your time. Cheap energy is women's liberation. The fact that some of the richest and most powerful people in the world are trying to deprive sub-Saharan Africans and South Asians of natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas is a moral abomination. It's completely messed up. That's what's going on right now. We can lift everybody out of poverty. There's no physical reason you can't do it. It's just mental derangement that we can't. You grow more food on less land, as we do in Europe and the United States, and there's more grasslands and forests for the wild animals. There's no sixth mass extinction. You can have everybody lift out of poverty and have more nature. Oh my God, it's incredible. I mean, think about it. On your deathbeds, maybe not mine, like there's no reason for anybody to be in poverty anymore. That's dumb. And you have more wild animals, gorillas and turtles. We bring in the sea turtles back. This is the future we can have. We just have to fight for it. Let's do it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Appreciate you. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Sorry for the F-bombs, guys. Sorry.
Hey guys, really quickly, please limit it to one question so everyone gets a chance to ask theirs, and keep this in mind for future Q&As. I guess, Michael, you can choose.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. Is it possible that you could send us the slides or make the PowerPoint accessible to us?
Yeah, they're on environmentalprogress.org. Go under the Environment tab, the case against environmental alarmism. They're all there.
Okay, thank you very much.
And not the new ones. Those are going to come out. I will put those out. And yes, I'll share them with you guys, of course. This was the middle part of this was all fresh and new for you guys. And I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge, where's Peter Boghossian? Did I lose him? Peter's been helping me on the cluster B personality disorder, as has Jordan Peterson. It's rough, so. Yes, sir. Yeah.
So we have an increasing trend of secularization in this country, and it's really people are losing their sense of, I don't know, pride or meaning.
Yes.
And they're trying to find something to replace that.
Yeah.
How are we going to be able to replace that? And is that something we need to do as people that are against this woke ideology?
Yes.
And is that something that the government should play a role in? Because you talked about propaganda, and culture is something that's mass media is integral to propagating a certain cultural values and norms. And since we've become balkanized cultures, everyone has the separate cultural values and such. So is it possible for America to have a coherent culture rooted in pride of our First Amendment and our Bill of Rights, or is that just
Yes.
that can't be?
Yes, you got it. You got it. I mean, yes. Thank you. I'm very happy because you got it. And yeah, I didn't quite get there, but patriotism used to be a thing. When I was a young man, I was very anti-American because I was very mad that we were murdering people in Nicaragua and El Salvador, supporting some pretty ugly activities in Central America. We did bad things in Vietnam. There's a lot of bad things about our country. There's a lot of things to dislike. As I've gotten older, it helps to travel a lot and you see what it's like in other countries, and you realize how special it is here and how tolerant we are. I mean, it's amazing. So I think I sort of start some core, love of humanity. We're amazing. That means if you love humanity, then you have to love civilization, because without civilization, it's terrible for ordinary folks, all but the elite. And then if you have civilization, then you would want freedom and freedom of speech. So if you get your Hobbes, you get your Locke. And then we've got this other work to do. We've still got 2.5 million people. There is climate change. We need to use gas and nuclear to lift everybody out of poverty. We do have environmental problems to solve. So for me, the exciting work is building this positive future. We don't need to be censoring each other. We don't need ginning up fake hate crises. We don't need to be ruled by the cops, by the police that want to police our speech. We don't need that. So yeah, I think that there's something really beautiful that we can construct. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was incredible. Just a quick question, and very much aligned with what my colleague said. What do you make of the idea that as Christianity falls, wokeism gets up because of the death of God, and there's this hole that people need to fill to find meaning in their life? Is it the case that because Christianity falls, people create new religions and worship them?
Yeah, I think so. That was sort of what I got at with the thing about, look, there's on your dark moments, there's a picture of just this is kind of coming to an end. Western civilization, it's destroying itself from within. This is an old problem. It's nihilism. It's been wrestled with for 150 years. The antidote is near the poison. America is so unique. It's so special. It is a country of reinvention, of consistent reinvention. People thought that things were really coming to an end in the late 60s, early 70s in the United States. And then we had this amazing process. In the 1970s, we had something called the Church Commission, which actually cleaned up the CIA and FBI, which had been so corrupted by bad guys. This is the J. Edgar Hoover spying on Martin Luther King period. This is them dosing people with acid and just doing nasty, weird things when our military and intelligence communities got out of control. We've got to clean them up. We got to get the psychopaths out of positions of responsibility. So that needs to happen. So for me, what's happening that's really exciting is journalism is really exciting. Barry Weiss is exciting. Matt Taibbi, Substack is super interesting. All the action is there. Public intellectual life is amazing. University of Austin, this is amazing. And this gives me hope. Truly only in America would this sort of thing be celebrated and supported in the ways that it is. So for me, I do think there's a huge amount of opportunity. It does mean you have to go into that darkness, though. You have to really understand what you're dealing with here, and be ready to let go of institutions and relationships that are unhealthy or toxic. It's such a cliche of self-help of letting go of your toxic relationships, but you got to do that, and you got to do it with those toxic institutions. And I think when you do, you'll find that people want it. It's this thing where when I hear from people that are just like, oh, thank you for saying that, thank you. Ugh. I just feel like I don't feel comfortable saying it. It's like a relief. It's like when you escape a really toxic group of people and you find a couple of friends to make outside of it, you feel like you can be free for the first time. I feel like that's where we're at right now. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. And also thank you so much for your environmental activism you've accomplished over your years. I was wondering if you could give a piece of advice for all of us as an environmental steward yourself, how we could be better stewards of the environment.
Well, I'll do one really easy one, which is stop throwing your plastic waste into the recycling bin. Plastic recycling is a fraud. 90% of that never goes and gets recycled because it's not profitable. It's cheaper to just use the waste byproduct from the petrochemical industry to make these. Throw these in the trash, please. What happens is the recycling companies don't recycle it and then they ship it to poor countries, and then guess what happens? It goes into the rivers and then it goes into the oceans, and you get an ocean plastic waste crisis. So the plastic waste crisis in the oceans was created by recycling. Now, that seems really banal and weird, just like a small thing, but everyone always wants to know what the environment, like what's one simple thing I can do? Please stop recycling your plastic. You can recycle your paper and your aluminum and your glass. Those are all great to recycle. The other important thing is to advocate for nuclear power, believe in nuclear power. It's not what we thought it was. It's not a nuclear weapon. The most important thing with nuclear is the change of attitudes. It's the most important thing for climate change. Natural gas is another important thing. We reduced our emissions 22% since 2005 to 2020, just 60% of that by moving from coal to gas. And talk back to the alarmism. Most environmental trends are going in the right direction. I mean, overwhelmingly. And I think you want to, and for me it's inspiring. You have a world of lifting everybody out of poverty and greater ecological biodiversity, more wild spaces, more natural places. Yeah.
Yeah, could you tell us how these cluster B personality types came to take over really important institutions and organizations?
How do they do it? Yeah, I mean, they're so strong and magnetic is part of it. I mean, narcissists are really charismatic and they're really compelling. In the political ponerology book, he talks about them as being spellbinding. So they're acting in they're engaged in a kind of hypnotic activity. They're really beautiful people often. They're very compelling. And narcissism, I should say, neither narcissism nor psychopathy are like all bad. They're really on a spectrum. There's a really good book called, the best book on psychopathy, which is now, they've made it politically correct. They've called it antisocial personality disorder. I think it's called The Gift of the Psychopath, if I'm not mistaken. And they sort of say a little psychopathy is good because being too fearful and too empathic can be debilitating. So a little narcissism is okay. It's okay to have some self-love, right? And some desire for recognition. If you do the right thing, the courageous thing, the truthful thing, you should get. I had the conversation about status with Barry. I just wanted to add that. There's nothing wrong with wanting status and recognition from your peers. You should want it for the right things. So I think the argument goes, I think what we're saying is, you have secularization, you also lose patriotism as a sort of spirituality, a kind of collective transcendence, right? People die for their country. It's amazing. It's a spiritual, I'm gonna die for my country and I'll live on by letting America live on or whatever country live on. When that then goes away, then a new morality has to take hold. It's this really base and ugly morality, I think, the kind of three parts I described. But you get the narcissists and the psychopaths who will then spellbind and then sort of enforce it through bullying. That's it's taken us some time. Peter's frustrated with me because I've been sitting on this research for a long time, but it's hard, complicated stuff, and psychology does not lend itself to hard empirical facts. You're trying to sort of more describe what we're seeing and feeling. Yeah.
Really, thank you for doing all this. I was wondering, like, what are red flags that, like, you see that make you intuitively feel like some news that seems really, like, factual is not actually factual?
Well, I mean, this with the increasing of hatred, it was just immediately set off my red flags. I mean, and if you read Steven Pinker's book, you know, which I don't entirely agree with, but basically, you know, violence has declined in the society. This sort of, you know, racial, religious, and sexual hatred has declined. You know, so when people start saying, "Oh, there's been this big increase in hatred," I'm kind of like, "Really? You know, doesn't seem right." You know, and that's part of it. And then also, it was accompanied with a desire for something wrong, which is more censorship. And so, similarly on climate change, it's like, well, we just don't, because of climate change, you know, sub-Saharan Africa just can't use fossil fuels. Sorry. You kind of go, well, wait a second. So, like Jordan Peterson has this great line, you know, which is if you can't tell what somebody's motivation is, look at the consequences of their action. If the consequence of climate action is that sub-Saharan Africa is being deprived the natural gas that they produce, which is also the feedstock for fertilizer, which is what's required to grow more food and use less land and save more nature, then you got to be like, what's that really about? Kind of a weird, creepy power trip, really. Sure.
Who do you think is the main driving force behind all this?
You mean as like a... I mean, I think so, you know, Nietzsche has a really great aphorism, which is that, you know, there's no explanations, only descriptions. And so you can see in this talk, I kept being like, well, it's kind of driven by this reaction to Trump and Brexit. And then you kind of go, well, it's also kind of, after the war on terror, there was all this apparatus that needed to go somewhere. And then you kind of go, well, it's the rise of the social media and the internet. And then you kind of go, well, it's secularization. You know, and then it's coming from within the culture. It's genuinely coming from within the culture, and then the elites are taking advantage of it. So you can definitely we should keep trying to peel the onion, but you know, you kind of get at the bottom of it, and it's people being small. It's people thinking that somehow, like, there's not enough atmosphere for poor people around the world to use fossil fuels. It's not just that some people just have most people just have bad information, but other people know better. They know that actually it doesn't work like that. You know, that actually to be protected from the consequences of climate change, you need to have abundant and cheap energy. So there's something wrong in the motivation.
Hi, thank you for coming. You brought up personality disorders, which obviously can be interpreted as like dismissive or inflammatory or any of those things, because, you know, you can't rationalize with psychopaths, you can't rationalize with narcissists and, you know, hysterics. So how does that information help us approach woke people and, just engage with them?
I think you can. You know, one thing I wanted to say is, so I think it's important to understand, you know, psychopathy and narcissism on a spectrum, and that some amount of it is actually healthy, and that it's also situational. So there may be a disposition, but also, you know, we see good people behaving badly in bad situations. And so one thing is to try to get people out of those situations, and also just, you know, as just a basic personal security issue, to avoid those situations. It's kind of the most important thing when you look at personal security issues: avoid bad situations. And then I did want to get at the debunking a bit, because I did want to say that I've actually been very happy and surprised lately, because we've been debunking this idea that there's been an increase in hatred and anti-Semitism and racism. And we've just been doing it on Substack and Twitter and, you know, and some podcasts and whatnot, but it's working. Like, I can tell it's working because, like, literally they've, like, the United Nations and these other people that were saying there was an increase have stopped, you know, and we can ratio them. You guys know, ratio, that's what the kids say. You know, like when the head of the United Nations says there's been an increase in hate, and I kind of go, actually, there hasn't, and here's the evidence, and you're just looking at a reporting bias. You know, a couple weeks later, they just go, we have to fight the hatred in society. Okay, sure. So I do think you have to kind of do it at all levels. You have to debunk it, and then you have to kind of go, where's this coming from, and why are you doing that? What's the agenda here?
All right, guys, we just have time for one last question, so that's you.
Thank you. It starts with me and it ends with me. That's great. I've noticed you haven't really spoken about the issue of corporate power and money in your talk. I kind of feel like this is missing. Can you maybe illuminate us if there is a connection, how deep this connection is, and maybe also the corporations and maybe the financial institutions who play a role in that?
Yeah. So the interest of the news media has always been to have your attention, so that they can then sell your attention to an advertiser, right? So you're the product being sold to the advertiser. That's very important to understand. So that's always there, and I think being aware of that is important. There is one remedy, there's one very partial remedy, which is to move more to subscriber-based media, but it'll be partial because not everybody, I have a subscriber-based media company, I guess you would call it, Substack, and we have no ads, but it's pretty limited, and even when we publish on Twitter, there's ads being sold next to it, so I think it's to be aware of that. I don't think that there's much we can do about that business model anytime soon. It's just part of it. And so there is that bias, I think, that Barry talked about doomerism there. But I would just point out, too, that there's also an audience for debunking. You know, it's exciting to see something debunked. You know, people ask me, you know, my friends are always like, why is it that, like, everything you do is controversial? And it's like, well, if it's not controversial, like, why would I work on it? Like, why would I just be like, yes, the conventional wisdom is correct. Like, I have a bunch of conventional beliefs. It's just not very interesting. What's interesting is when you're like, the conventional wisdom is really wrong. That's really interesting. And that does get attention. So I don't think that the attention economy is necessarily a bad thing. Similar views with status and recognition and attention. I don't think it has to be a bad thing. And similarly, if you lift 2.5 people out of poverty, out of burning wood and dung as their primary fuels, some people are going to make a lot of money doing that. I mean, really, it's great for the economy. You know, 2.5 billion people going from living on, you know, $2 to $5 a day, suddenly living on $20,000 a year. It's just amazing for the economy. It's great for the whole global economy. So I'm not an anti-capitalist by any means, but I'm also, I do think government has a very positive role. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with the institutions we have. The problem is that they've become pathocratic, and they've been taken over by people in the grip of bad ideas and by people that are more on that are too far along on that cluster B spectrum than we would want them to be. Thank you guys again. I really appreciate you.